Hello and welcome. We are so excited to have you joining us today for Scientists in Action, Forest Fire and Times That Are Drier. I'm your host, Kate, from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, where we are not broadcasting from today, because in fact, we are here live at Rocky Mountain National Park. This is going to be a very exciting program. We have a park ranger with us today. We cannot wait to talk to you, but a couple housekeeping items I want to touch base on before we get going. If you are off camera schools and you have questions, we've got an open chat, so you can go ahead and be putting your questions or responses in that chat. If you're going to be on camera, so Weichel Elementary, we're going to ask that you stay off camera and muted just until we call on you for open Q&A in about 20 minutes or so. Otherwise, we'll have polls, we'll have kind of that open chat, and you can kind of engage that way. So without further ado, I would love to introduce Haley Stapleton, who works here at the park. Haley, what would you like to tell us about a bit about yourself, as well as this amazing space, and take it away?
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Ranger Haley. I'm so excited to connect with all of you today from Rocky Mountain National Park. This is where I live and work. I am the virtual programs coordinator here, and I connect with people like you each and every day across the world. And I'm so excited to connect with you today to talk about Rocky Mountain National Park, how special it is, and how it interacts with fire. So Rocky Mountain, first of all, is very special because it's protected as a national park, which means that we all get the chance to see this place untouched by human intervention and a beautiful landscape. But of course, that has some things that we're going to learn today about management and especially how it interacts with fire. So that's our topic, and I'd love to even just start with the idea of fire. What is fire and what causes a fire to happen? And I have an awesome graphic to help us demonstrate what that is. So we have here a fire triangle. And what this is every piece that we need for a fire to happen. We have oxygen, heat, and fuel. And you need all three of these things for a fire to happen. And so a fire could be classified as a wildfire or a structural fire. So today we're going to focus on wildfires, fires that happen in nature. And it's really important to note that Rocky Mountain National Park has a history of fire. There's always been fire here and always will be fire here. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into how unique Rocky Mountain National Park is, the ecosystems that are here, and how they've lived with fire throughout time. So I first want to talk about the different types of ecosystems. We have the tops of our mountains in the alpine, and then we have right below that where most of our forests are. They're thick and dense. It's called our subalpine. Then we have a mix of meadows and trees where I'm standing right now called the montane. And then our fourth and last ecosystem is the riparian, which is all of the water in our parks. Now we're going to focus on some of those trees that are in the montane and the subalpine today, because they contain the history of fire in this place. So to talk best about those tree species, I'm going to walk you over here to one of my favorite trees in the park. So this tree right here is called a ponderosa pine tree. It's part of the ponderosa pine forests that we see in our montane ecosystem. This tree has always lived with fire and will always live with it in the future. So to be able to do that, it has special adaptations or ways to deal with fire. One being, look how massive it is. It's a huge tree. I could barely fit my arms the whole way around it. That's because it has thick bark. And this thick bark can be up to 5 inches thick that act like a shield that helps protect our tree from burning on the inside, which would destroy the whole tree. So this way, it might just char the outside and then move on. Then another cool adaptation that this tree has to deal with fire is if I reach my arms all the way up, I can't even touch the first branch on this tree. And that's because this tree's branches they self-prune or they fall off, like this one, closer to the ground, so that if a fire were to come through on the ground, it wouldn't reach the tops of our trees, the canopy, which are more likely to burn. So this is an amazing tree with amazing adaptations that can survive fire. There's a couple other trees I'd like to talk about too, and one being an aspen tree. And aspen trees are incredible species that actually form a colony. They're one clone underground and then grow up their roots into the trees that we see today. Now, if a fire were to come through, what happens is those roots are so deep, they leave the perfect spot for those actual branches and the stems to grow once again. So it's a nice place for it to hide while the fire passes through to regrow again. And then the last tree that I love to talk about that is really adapted to our fires is our lodgepole pine trees. They live in the subalpine, so just above where I am right now, and they have trees so close together, we call them dog hair trees, because they look like hairs on a dog. And since they're so close together, if a fire came through, it would actually burn the whole forest. However, they have a backup plan where they have special cones or pine cones that only open if there is heat. So a fire comes through, opens up these cones, and then a new forest can arise. So let's head back over and talk a little bit more about fires in Rocky Mountain.
Those are some pretty smart trees. This is a very cool ecosystem.
Very smart trees, right? So this place in Rocky Mountain National Park is very special, has a history of fire. However, we're now going to talk about how those fires can behave and how their behavior can impact the environment in maybe ways we don't want and do want. So right now we have our first poll of the day. Kate is going to give us that poll about fire behavior.
Yes. So we would love for you to engage and give us kind of your thoughts on this. Which of the following do you think can influence the way a wildfire behaves? Is it A, whether or not they started naturally or because of human causes? Is it what the weather was doing that day? Is it the shape of the land or the topography that's burning? The type and amount of stuff there is to burn or the fuel from that triangle? Or is it maybe all the above? So students, teachers, however you have your computer set up, go ahead and place your vote in that poll or post in the chat. Which of the following can influence the way a fire burns? Take about 2 seconds more and vote in the poll if you have not done so already. All right, and let's see how our friends voted. Wow, a resounding all of the above. Is there a right answer? How'd they do?
Good job, everybody. You are exactly right. All of those things influences how wildfires behave in nature. And I have yet again another triangle that I'd love to show us all. I'll wait a second for us to get the video back up. All right, perfect. So here I have another triangle. This is the wildfire behavior triangle. So these are all of the things that influence wildfire behavior. So here we notice there's weather, topography, the shape of the land, and fuel. So the type and amount that is there to burn. So these three things interact to influence how fire behaves. The other thing that's not on this triangle is going to be whether it is caused by humans or if it is caused naturally. So combining these things helps us to understand just how a wildfire behaves and can impact the environment. So I am curious now what those impacts look like. And we have another poll to help us think about fires, not only in Rocky Mountain National Park, but in the west, because this gives us a huge picture of fires in this region.
Yes. So we would like you to vote in yet another poll. The American West and Rocky Mountain region seems to have quite a lot of fires. The question is, are these fires always bad no matter what? Maybe natural for the environment, so we should let them burn? Or do you think it depends on the fire? Some could be good and maybe some are bad. So go ahead, teachers, students, vote in that poll. What do you think? Are fires bad, good, or maybe just kind of dependent on the fire itself? Looks like maybe one crew cannot see the poll. If you cannot see the poll, you can go ahead and vote in the chat just by typing your answer. And yet, to reiterate that question, the question was essentially, do you think fires, these wildfires, are bad? Are they maybe natural and therefore should be left alone? So good. Or maybe it depends on the fire. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. Alrighty, let's go ahead and close that poll and see how our friends did. Another 100%. We're not getting a lot of diversity in answers, but maybe that's a good thing. It knows it means our audience knows their stuff. It sounds like everyone says it depends on the fire. Is there a right answer? What do you think, Ranger Haley?
I think you all are exactly right. It does depend on the fire, because if we go back to that fire triangle, that fire behavior triangle, that will determine how intense a fire will be. So how big, how much destruction does it have? So if we have a fire that maybe is not having a ton of weather, that is hot and dry, and winds that are really intense, really high speed winds, then maybe we won't have an intense fire. However, if we have maybe as well, if we think about topography, really shallow lands, it might not move as fast through that land as opposed to canyon walls that are really steep that would make that fire move more intensely. And then in terms of fuels, we could also think about if we have a lot of dead trees, maybe ones that are dry, those will burn more intensely than our ones that are wet. So all of these things are going to influence our fire behavior, and that can tell us whether it will completely destroy an area and be a big fire, or to be a smaller fire that has some opposite effects. So instead of destruction, it's rejuvenation or renewal. And we could see a good example of this in one of the photos we have to show you, and how a fire is able to restore the nutrients in the ground, making those very healthy and fertile for our plants to grow from. So we'll see if we can get a picture up for that here in just a second.
Yeah, looks like we're also, I'm going to apologize if you've noticed, our image looks really small. We're still here. I think we're just having some connection issues.
Okay.
It is hard to broadcast from the field. So thank you for bearing with us. But here's that picture that Ranger Haley was just talking about.
Yeah, so you could see from the top, that is maybe a year after a fire had come through Rocky Mountain National Park in 2012. The bottom picture is what it looked like right after the fire. So we could see just the difference in 1 year. It allowed this meadow to grow back a vibrant green and renew this ecosystem. So again, those fires can be destructive, but they can also renew so much in the environment, especially the ones that we have here, which are fire adapted ecosystems.
That is very cool. Well, and it's wild to think, like it looked so burned and it was so burned, yet there was just life waiting to explode from that soil afterwards.
Yes.
So that sounds like a way that fire can be good, I guess. Are there ways in which fire is not so good, or examples even here at the park where they've been more destructive?
Exactly. So we can have those instances like in 2012, we had the Fern Lake fire that came through and actually ended up restoring some of that ecosystem. However, more recently, we have had fires that are larger and more intense here in Rocky Mountain National Park. And those happened in 2020. And that was the East Troublesome Fire and the Cameron Peak Fire. And they were happening at the same exact time in October. So we have a map now up of those fires. The green is the outline or the boundary of Rocky Mountain National Park, and the red boxes or blotches that we see are the two fires happening, our Cameron Peak to the north and our East Troublesome to the west. So we could see that they're almost the same size as Rocky Mountain National Park itself.
Wow.
Very large fires.
These are huge.
Yeah. And what made them so huge is some of those weather, fuels, and topography that influenced it. So here's a new map of the progression of the fires. So it started in that blue area, in an area that had a ton of dead trees that were killed by beetles. So it ignited in this really dry fuel. And then in October, near the end of October, it went from 18,000 acres to 180,000 acres in less than 24 hours. And why was that? That's because of our weather. The wind was up to 100 miles per hour. So with these two factors combined, it caused a very intense fire, and we can see evidence in our trees still to this day. So let's look at this photo now. And I want you to notice the shape of the trees, but also the ground. So the shape of the trees here, it was caused by the wind blowing those trees over, and the fire was so hot that it melted them in place. And then the ground, it looks a little bit different than our rejuvenation story, right? Our ground is bare. It's barren because it was so hot and so intense. This soil will not grow any plants for a really long time. And we can see that in this image as well. It's a little bit different. You can see the destruction that this fire caused as opposed to the renewal and rejuvenation that we saw in our 2012 fire.
Yeah, this is very destructive looking. This is, you can't see that there's any trees that have survived. So
Exactly.
So even a ponderosa probably wouldn't survive a fire like this, correct?
Probably not, right?
Oh,
It has
sad.
those barriers and that shield of its bark, but if something this intense moves through, it can be really hard to protect and save these areas. So Rocky Mountain National Park has some special ways to be able to combat and manage these large fires. And one of those ways is through a awesome crew called the Fuels Reduction Crew. And this crew is very special, where it goes out and it chops down some of the trees that are dead to not have as much fuel that would then grow into a massive fire. So this helps prevent these destructive fires like we saw for the East Troublesome. And you could see this video of them in action. So they're using chainsaws with protective equipment, helmets. They have chainsaw chaps to protect their legs. And they're knocking these trees down, and eventually they will cut them up into piles. They're slash burn piles that they will burn in the winter in a controlled manner to be able to reduce that fuel in that area to decrease the chance of a really large and intense fire. So we can see those piles here in this next image. And then we even have a video of what it looks like in the winter time when they burn these piles. And they burn in the winter because it's more controlled that way. You have an amazing snow that helps prevent it from spreading anywhere else.
This is very cool. I think it's interesting too, because I don't know, I think often, maybe personally, I think of like protecting the forest by never cutting down trees or never setting fires, but this is just kind of the exact opposite of that. And that is how you can actually make an ecosystem healthier or just help it stay healthy by doing some of that work, by cutting down trees, by setting a fire if it's in a controlled environment. So
yeah, it's a proactive manner to respond to fires and to manage the ecosystems and forest health. Now, there is another crew that allows us to be able to understand that ecosystem health. It's called our fire effects crew. So they will go and they will make sure that they understand the different plants and trees and what is growing in that area to see how a fire affects that area. So we can see this video now, they're measuring the plants, identifying them, and they're seeing their regrowth and how they responded to that fire.
So what about when a fire is actively burning? So it looks like now we have people who look at the fire afterwards to understand it for the future and people who are working to prevent it. But how do people manage it when it's already happening?
That is a really awesome question. So we have yet another fire crew who is called our Wildland Hotshot Fire Crew. And they are the ones who are actively fighting the fires on the scene. And we can see a photo of them now right here. And they are going out and they're stopping the spread of fire in a very different way than we might think of as opposed to firefighters in cities. So those are structural firefighters. These are wildland firefighters. So they have to carry everything they need with them to stop this fire, which they use tools to remove that fuel, like chainsaws, even an axe they'll use. And then they also will carry all of the things that they need. So we could see some of these rangers sharpening those tools, getting them ready to use for fighting fires.
Wow.
And that backpack, believe it or not, could be 50 pounds.
That is wild. I just can't believe that photo of them. Yeah, there they are again. It would never occur to me to hike like 10 miles to fight a fire. That must be exhausting and very hard work.
Right. So they can't just pull off the side of the road, use their fire truck to put it out. They usually have to hike in, or they have the help of a helicopter or an airplane that will actually drop water to support their efforts, because sometimes it's not safe to go in to fight these fires. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that now in terms of how do we know when to even go and stop a fire? I think it might be a common myth for national parks and the idea that national parks will let fires burn whenever possible. However, that's not the case. And there's three main priorities in national parks to fight fires. And that is life, properties, and ecosystems. And it really does depend on where you are. So Rocky Mountain National Park is a park that's very close to neighboring communities like Estes Park, which has 7,000 people who live here. And on the west side, we have Grand Lake, which is very similar in size. So two communities very close to our national park's boundary. So you could see that we have to have some measure to protect the life and property here because so many people are in this area. But I want us to think about maybe how that'd be different in Alaska, per se, in a place like Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It's our largest national park in the National Park Service system. And it's so big, I think 16 million acres, and Rocky Mountain National Park is maybe 200,000 acres. So you could see just the difference there in just size, but usually there's more wilderness areas in that area, and there's not as many communities. So that allows us to hit that third priority, to keep that fire-adapted ecosystem healthy, just as we could, because it's that huge ecosystem, and it allows us to let that fire burn without the fear of life and property being in the way.
That is really cool. I have to just throw this out. Someone in the chat just said, I live in Alaska.
Nice.
So this is cool. We can see just how relevant this is across the globe. So that is really neat.
Yeah, exactly. And fires don't just happen here, they happen around the world. And it's also important to note that the National Park Service manages fires in this way, but the United States Forest Service and other entities like private lands, they all manage fires in different ways as well, in the best way possible with the best knowledge from all of our scientists who work in this park.
Very cool. Well, at this point, I would love to invite our friends from the classroom on camera and maybe take a break from our field camera since obviously our connection is still not 100%. So thank you again for bearing with us. We just cannot wait to see you on camera. So Weichel Elementary, if you want to go ahead and unmute and bring yourself on camera, we can't wait to hear your questions. Hello, we can see you.
Hi.
Say hello.
Hi.
Nice and loud. Talk right to the computer.
Hi. What made most of the
What question?
what made most of the Rocky Mountain fires occur?
What made the most recent fires occur? Is that your question?
Sounded like that to me.
Okay, awesome. That is a very good question, right? Because that also influences how that fire behaves, whether it's human caused or natural, right? So these two fires that happened here, one is known to be human caused, and the other is a huge probability that it was human caused. And if we speak on a larger scale, 85% of fires are caused by humans, and the other 15 are natural by lightning or lava. So you could see just how much we play a role in those wildfires and its behavior.
85%. Wow. And I would challenge you. We do have obviously our iPad with us out in the field. If you could throw into the chat, what are some of the ways that you think humans cause fires? Because sometimes if we think about what causes fires, we can then think about what we can do to prevent fires as well. So what are some of the things that you might do when you're visiting spaces like this to make sure that there aren't any large fires happening? Looks like here's one already that says cigarette butts.
Yeah, even just one little spark can cause a fire that's big.
Fireworks, that's another one.
Oh, yes, you have to be careful with that, especially in the driest time in July, right? For July 4th.
Nice. Campfires. Ooh, here's one that says put out fire with water and dirt and make sure all embers are out.
Yes,
You have a trick even, I think, right?
Yes,
Okay.
I love how this person said that because I like to think of it as this big soup. We want to drown the fire, mix up all the charcoal and the water together to create this amazing soup that makes everything wet and cold, and there's no heat signature left for anything to pop up and spread out and cause a fire.
Nice. Here's just a couple more. It says, be careful not to start a fire or to pay attention where your fire is.
That is also amazing. So we're in Rocky Mountain National Park, and we have certain rules and regulations to come here, especially involving fires and where we have them. So at Rocky Mountain National Park, you can only have a fire in a designated campground or a designated circle or pit. And so other places might be different. So we encourage you to look at the regulations and rules before you go out and have a fire wherever you may be.
Nice. Yeah, this is all great ideas. Well, thank you for that amazing question, especially because it allowed other people to engage with it as well. What are more questions from Weichel Elementary?
Why do different fires have a different impact on the environment?
Ooh, different fires and different impacts.
Yes, definitely. And I think that goes back to how that fire behaves. And if it is a very intense fire, right? We saw with our East Troublesome fire, it destroyed a lot of the area. But if we have less intense fires that don't behave as strongly, then we can have more of that restoration. So it really depends on those weather, fuels, and topography that's in that area at the same time.
I would bet also too, like, if the ecosystem is adapted to fires, they probably welcome that. But if you are an ecosystem with plants and animals that have never seen fire or aren't really used to them, it might have a really different impact and be higher destruction, I'm betting.
Yeah,
So.
exactly right. So our ponderosa pine trees that we saw earlier are perfect and they can deal with fire, but there's some plants and animals that just can't and might have a larger impact, like Kate said.
Cool. That was a good question. What's
Mhm.
another question from the classroom?
What do you think wildfire season will look like in 2040?
Ooh, I caught just the beginning of that.
I caught just the beginning as well. Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, it sounded like something about wildfire season.
What do you think wildfire season will look like in 2040?
Ooh, what will it look like in 2040? It's a very interesting question. It starts to get us to think about maybe not just that weather piece, but that climate piece. So weather over time and what our climate is doing and how it's causing hotter and drier conditions that might end up influencing fires in a more strong manner than we're used to. And I can say that we're experiencing not more wildfires per year, but larger wildfires per year because of those hot and dry and windy conditions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I would also encourage you to think about and investigate on your own outside of this program. Where are fires happening? Are they happening just in the mountains? Are they happening in grasslands? Are they happening more frequently where people are putting houses? So I think it really depends on, what does society look like in the next almost 20 years? Where are we putting buildings? How are we responding to those kind of climate shifts that Ranger Haley was talking about? So that is a great question. And I would love to see some of our future scientists maybe tackle some of them as we go on. So cool. What's another question from Weichel?
How do the fires in Oregon affect the community around the mountains?
Ooh, that's a really great question because wildfires, right, they can spread, but other effects from the fires like smoke, we can see across North America, right? Especially if we're talking about ones from Oregon. Just yesterday, we saw the effects here in Rocky Mountain National Park because it was hazy and smoky out here. And that's because our earth is moving and our wind patterns are all moving, and that moves that smoke into our area.
Wow, yeah, this is a really intense picture. Is this from Rocky? All these hazy smoke clouds and all that too?
Yep, this is from Rocky Mountain National Park. This is from the Cameron Peak fire. So we could see that it was burning north. Only a small piece came into Rocky, but we can see the smoke all throughout this region.
Yeah, this would be really hard to breathe in, I think. Not ideal.
Not at all.
I know. We did get a question earlier. Someone was saying it is pretty interesting. And why is it that we can sometimes even get the smoke from Canada? But just when you think about how those winds pick up, and I think you were telling us a story even earlier about how because of the wind, like East Troublesome got to be a really big fire, right?
Yes, it did. So with that wind and that huge burning fire, the town of Estes Park not only was evacuated during that time because of the fire approaching the town, but because of the air quality. It was raining ash and soot and all of the stuff that comes from fires, that it wasn't safe to breathe that air and they had to move away from it.
Yikes. Yeah. And I mean, just even thinking about how that fire can spread using wind is definitely a factor. So cool. Yeah. What a good question. Oh, and great images to see too. What are more questions from Weichel Elementary? These are great. Keep them coming.
Where can animals go when the forest burns?
Oh,
really good question.
I think about this a lot.
Me too. I love this question because I studied wildlife biology in college and love thinking about behaviors of animals and responses to things like fires. So most animals are so incredible that they can smell and sense the fire coming in the ground long before humans can. And that allows them to escape in time. But those are like our bigger animals, right? Like our elk that live here, our deer, things like that. So you might be thinking, what about the tiny insects or those squirrels in the trees? Well, they also have a way to deal with it. They'll burrow deep into the ground, which insulates them and protects them from the high heat that a fire can cause.
Okay, good.
Pretty cool. I know.
I like that answer. I like that the animals are safe. And also, it's wild to think that just like the plants who are kind of smarter than the fire, the animals are also kind of adapted to those ecosystems. So,
Exactly.
cool question.
Yeah.
Let's get another question.
When do you think the next wildfire, like the 2020 fire, might happen?
Was the question, when do you think the next fire will happen?
That's kind of what I
When do
heard.
you think when do you think the next wildfire, like the 2020 fire, might happen?
Oh, another big one.
Well, that is a really good thing to bring up, is that now that our fires, our forests here had burned quite a bit during those 2020 fires, if another fire came through, there's not as much fuel for it to burn. So we likely wouldn't see it being as intense, which is good for our communities and our park and the people that are in it, right? However, I also want to speak to the fact that we've had a wet season, a wet summer. We've had a lot of rainfall up here and the grasses are still green. We still have our aspen tree leaves still green as well. So I think, it depends on that weather too, and that weather pattern. So we've had a more wet year, so we may not see as many big fires too.
That would be ideal. So, I know. Sounds like even with your fire effects crew, they're also asking the exact same question as you, is like, when are we going to see another big fire and can we prevent it? So, so long as we keep sending scientists out to ask these amazing questions, of all generations, and, keep thinking about how can we, even as citizens, prevent fire, maybe we won't see any big fires. That would be great.
Exactly. And even the role that we're taking on today, in helping educate and teach people about the impacts of fire and what these scientists are doing, so we all can understand our role in this as well.
Very cool. Let's get at least one, if not two more questions from the classroom.
How many fires are in the national park today?
Ooh, how many fires are in the national park today?
So for Rocky Mountain National Park, we don't have any fires, which is amazing. Within maybe the other national parks across our world, I'm not quite sure, but we do have a website that's run by the National Interagency Fire Center, and it's a really cool website that allows us to see the different active fires and even the smoke that's caused by them. So I encourage you to do your research after this program to find out if there's anything near you.
Very cool. Yeah, I guess that would also be good to know, just in case for safety and things like that. Yikes. That was a good question. Let's get one last question from Wycliffe Elementary.
How can smoke survive rainstorms and not dissipate?
Ooh, smoke not dissipate in rainstorms. That is a really good question. I have not thought about that.
I have not thought about that either. I personally would have to go and look that up after this program. So I think I will, and I encourage you as well. And maybe we can swap answers to find out what really is happening when rain comes and there's still smoke.
Yeah. My only guess would just be that smoke is really, really, really tiny particles. So once it's aerosolized and it's in our air, it can be pretty pervasive, but I'm also not a meteorologist. So that would be my guess. Sometimes in science, you make guesses and then you have to research and experiment and explore and see if you're right. So if you find out an answer to this, send us an email, because now we're going to be talking about this all the rest of the day.
Exactly.
So thank you, Wycliffe Elementary. Those were some amazing questions. We have a couple questions from the chat I'm going to throw your way. One is, do you know anything about how, for example, Indigenous people stewarded the land using fire?
So that is something that Rocky Mountain National Park is still trying to learn and figure out throughout time, and the connections that we have with our tribal partners. we do know one little piece of information about huckleberry bushes and how our indigenous peoples in this area would burn those bushes for then the next year for those berries to grow even more.
Oh, that's cool,
Yeah.
because that relates back to that whole thing of you saying ecosystems sometimes come back stronger after they've been burned. So
Exactly.
yeah.
So we're still learning so much more about our tribal partners that inhabited this area and still call this place home and call it and recognize it as a sacred and special place. So we'll have to update you as we hear more information.
Yeah. Sounds like another good kind of research and questioning opportunity. Talk to people in your community, because I know not everyone is from Colorado. Even I know there are folks from Alaska and Utah and Washington, and even Illinois and a couple other states today. So do some research. I'm sure it looks different. The history of the land and the people who stewarded this land before us. And you might get different answers. So, and of course, let us know when you find that out, because I want to know too. Some other questions is, how does lava start fires? I guess this is thinking about places, not us, that has volcanoes, but how would lava start a fire?
Yeah, so lava is that magma that's coming up from the mantle, the inner earth, and it's spewing out of maybe these ground openings or even volcanoes, and they're super hot, super hot. Like, I think underneath, maybe the mantle is like 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's
So as
really
it
hot.
reaches the surface, right, it's still trying to cool off. And so it's very hot that spreads onto maybe open grasses or trees, and then it's very likely that they would burn.
Cool. This kind of ties into actually another question, and it's that can things burn if it's not like a forest? Can we see fires that aren't in forested areas?
Yeah, so a wildfire can be any fire in nature. So here in Rocky Mountain National Park, we see most of them in our forests because we have lots of trees. However, places like maybe Texas that are full of prairies and grasslands can also burn. And I think we have a cool statistic about states that have lots of fires.
Yeah. So actually someone in an earlier class asked, they're like, what is the state that has had the most fires? And you can't see him because he's off camera, but one of our tech crew looked it up, and California has had the most fire, at least in the last, I think, year or two it was, followed by Texas, where I see we have a couple people from, as well as North Carolina. So when you think about this, the different climates and the environments, you don't have to have a forest for there to be a fire. If there's grass or bushes or just anything flammable, it could definitely catch fire and get out of hand if we're not careful. So cool. Well, that was kind of a great question to end on. Is there anything you want to leave the students with today as far as just getting to work in a park system, being stewards to the environment?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say is thank you all so much for joining us. And I also want to say that even as a visitor or someone who goes into nature, you don't have to be a park ranger to help protect these areas. Doing some of the things that we talked about today and just understanding rules, regulations, and how that can help our environment and fires and how they're caused is really important. But also, if you're interested in being a ranger, there's so many different types. In my top of my head, I think there's maybe over 8 kinds of rangers. So I'm just a small piece to the puzzle as an education ranger. We have our fire rangers who we're so lucky to meet and see their work. But we also have rangers that go out and study our animals. We have rangers who work on our trails, who work on buildings and things like that. So the possibilities are endless. And we all have a different way to get here too. So I studied wildlife biology, but we have people who started wildland firefighting at the age of 18. So you have many different paths, and maybe you can be a ranger one day too.
Cool. That would be awesome. One thing I think that's really cool and has really stood out to me in this session in particular is it sounds like there's a lot of people from different states who also have a lot of great questions and insight even about how to prevent fires or how to be stewards to the environment. So keep asking questions, keep being curious, research, explore, be scientists up until your old ages, because there's always ways to do it, it sounds like. And of course, come to the parks and say hi to people like Haley. So anyways, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I do want to say thank you. I want to say thank you, of course, to Weichel Elementary for your amazing on-camera questions. I want to say thank you to everyone who posted in the chat. You also had amazing questions and feedback. Thank you, Ranger Haley. This has been so fun. Coming here is amazing. I wish I could work here every day. Thank you, Asa, for being in our kind of tech studio and looking up that California fact. And Kim, who you can't see as well. She's behind the camera making this happen. So thank you, everyone. We can't wait to see you next time on October 3rd. We do have another program coming up. This one is actually a special edition Scientists in Action, Walking with Gorillas. We have a Ugandan wildlife vet who will be visiting us in Denver, and we are so lucky to get to talk to her. So sign up for another program. If not in October, maybe another month. But we are just so excited that you joined us today. So
Yes, thank you all.
see you next time.